There we go. Okay. Our team here at La Trobe is very excited with the lineup that we have today. And for those who have joined us last evening, I hope you experienced the wonderful energy that comes from sharing conversations with people who are interested in the same things that we are. And for those who have joined us today, well, a big welcome to you all. My name's Alana Johnson, and I'm privileged to facilitate today's speaker sessions. My career has been one of change making as a sociologist, a social worker, an academic, a board chair, a ministerial advisor, a pioneer of the rural women's movement, and as a co-founder and past president of Voices for Indi. So for this session, I'm going to invite Helen Haines to speak to us for about 20 minutes. We will then have about 20 minutes or so for Helen to answer your questions. So please post them in the chat box with the queue in front of them. We'll curate those questions and put them to her. Don't forget to have your screen on speaker view. And just a reminder that Chatham House rules will not be applying to the keynote speech. So Helen Haines, who needs an introduction? I heard her on the radio this morning across the state as I drove up here. So as you would know, in May 2019, Helen made history by becoming the first independent federal parliamentarian to succeed in the same electorate since Federation in 1901. With a doctoral degree in medical science and a background in epidemiology and public health, Helen is a nurse, a midwife, a teacher, and an academic. She is a community independent politician with a commitment to action on climate change, integrity, regional Australia, and the revitalisation of our democracy. Before I hand over to Helen, I just want to commend her, our independent member for Indi, for during these last 2 and revealing, challenging weeks in Parliament in Australia, we've seen Helen call out victim blaming, silencing and disempowerment of women, exposing the culture of political expediency that exists in our Parliament, and demanding higher standards of parliamentary behaviour. So on behalf of all of us, I think we can say thank you. It's our appreciation goes to you, Helen. And I'll hand over the screen to you. Look forward to what you've got to say. So the technology will catch up with us. Are you there, Helen?
Yes, I am.
Ah, there we are. Thank you.
Nearly there. Okay. All right. Can everyone see me and see the screen? Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Alana, and thank you to Kathy and all of the team behind this incredible weekend convention. I'm Helen Haines. I'm coming to you today from Bangarang country in northeast Victoria in Wangaratta, which is my home. And it's indeed an enormous privilege and honour for me to be working and speaking with you today. And I wish to acknowledge the Bangarang people and all Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders right across this magnificent nation of ours. I know you're coming from all over the country. I want to acknowledge the elders past and present and pay my tribute to 60,000 plus years of cultural knowledge, science, arts and learning. And it is my deep, deep desire that as a parliamentarian, I will be one voice and one participant in bringing justice and recognition to our Aboriginal people. So, what a joy to be here today. Alana and Kathy and all of the team asked me to speak to you today about being a community independent minded parliamentarian, why it matters, what it means, how it's done, the being and the doing, the where and the when. I mean, that's a pretty big brief. I'm going to do my best on that. And as Alana said, I'm planning to talk for about 20 minutes because I think the rest of the time is better spent with you asking questions, and we can have that really dynamic interaction, which is the fun of these things, really, isn't it? So, being a community independent, the Hunger Games. I think all of you know probably this extraordinary story about Katniss Everdeen. It's a classic story, isn't it? It's the classic mythology story. It's the hero's journey. And the important message from the Hunger Games is this, that hope is stronger than fear. And when I think about our democracy, and when I think about becoming a community independent, when I think about breaking the nexus, which is the big party's stronghold on our democracy, we need to step forward and let go of the fear of walking into that and hang on to the hope. And I think what we've experienced here in Indi and what we've subsequently seen in Warringah and what we've seen in other parts of this country as groups start to mobilise is that truly hope is stronger than fear. So what is the hero's journey? It is the classical myth construction of a story. We have the ordinary world where there's a call to adventure, and the hero usually refuses that call to adventure in the first instance. But then comes a meeting with a mentor, and that's important because the meeting of the mentor helps this adventurer to cross the threshold. And then they enter into a special world of tests and allies and enemies as they approach the innermost cave. There's usually an ordeal or two in the middle of that special world, but our hero usually emerges with the reward. They seize the sword and then they take the road back, the resurrection, the return with the elixir. And I think the hero's journey does epitomise so much of what a community needs to do, because the hero in the community independent story is not the independent themselves, it's the community. They are the hero. So just a little bit about my story, and this particular graphic is a brochure that the Indi team put together when they were trying to introduce me to the electorate. And it is the classic story, really, in that there's a lot of ordinary and not much extraordinary in my background. And the story goes that I grew up on a little farm in southwest Victoria with 4 brothers. Up in the left-hand corner of the screen, you can see the old black and white of me on my bicycle with a couple of my brothers and an old dairy shed in the background. I went to a tiny little school in a little place called Urack. At tops, there was 15 kids there. There was usually around 8 or 9, and almost all of them were my cousins. And from there, I took kind of a pretty standard path for a country girl who grew up in the 60s. I became a nurse. I went off to Melbourne. I got married, I had kids, I moved back to the country where those kids were raised. And then I went on a little bit of a side trip and decided that I wanted to learn a bit more from my nursing degree, and found myself undertaking a doctoral degree in Sweden. Took the family there and undertook a PhD in medical science. It was about the time of returning from that Cathy McGowan and the whole independence movement in Indi was really kicking off. And you can see there me with a Putting Indi First t-shirt on. And I was very reluctant. I was very reluctant initially about joining this campaign. My husband and son were super involved, and you'll hear from Phil, my husband, later on. And I thought it was all a bit fanciful, to be honest. I was pretty busy at the time. I'd finished that doctorate. I was doing a postdoctorate. My dad had recently died and I'd been caring for him. And I felt like I didn't have any time in my life to be getting on board with this crazy movement that was trying to unseat the long-standing Liberal in Indi and overturn with some kind of orange revolution. But I was seduced like so many others, and I donned that orange t-shirt and got involved for the very first time in my life with a political movement. I'd never been a member of a party, had never given out a how to vote card, had always shown up to cast my vote knowing what I was going to do and got out of there as fast as I could. So that was a pretty radical change for me as an individual, but for us as a family and for us as a whole community, of course, to get involved with this idea of having an independent in Indi. So I became an unwilling and then very willing and then very committed and incredibly enthusiastic volunteer with Kathy, both in the 2013 election and subsequently in the 2016 election. So from going to that ordinary world, I was called to the adventure of backing Kathy. And of course, we've all had lots of adventures along the way, whether they be political or otherwise, but that was a particularly exciting adventure for me. The next step, of course, was to get to a point where I started to contemplate that maybe I could move from being a volunteer to actually being a candidate and possibly the next community independent for Indi. In order to do that, in the classic hero's journey, of course, I had to meet the mentor, and the mentor indeed was Kathy McGowan. And indeed, in order to take the next step, I had to cross the threshold, as is the classic next point in the story. So getting to yes, to be a community independent, I had to not only meet that mentor, but see how that mentor worked. The story of Kathy is well known to all of you, and I'm not going to go through it because, well, of course you know it. And if you don't know it by now, you're part of this convention, then it's time you read the book. But meeting Kathy as the community independent for Indi and going to volunteer with her in the office in Canberra and being on the hustings with her during 2013 and 2016 was the classic story of if you can't see it, you can't be it. And when I saw Kathy being a community independent, I thought, well, maybe I could be that too. Maybe I just could. So to get to the point of Kathy handing the baton to me, there was, of course, a process. And to even think of moving from the ordinary into the adventure phase of this great classic mythology tale, other people need to encourage you too. Other people perhaps need to suggest to you that maybe you could be the next person. And that indeed was my experience. A few people did. But of course, along the way, coming to the point that Kathy was even considering retirement, we had what was an extraordinarily unstable period of government. We all know the Section 44 saga. So Indi was on standby, thinking that if Kathy didn't want to do a third term, were we prepared to hand over to the major parties again, or were we wanting to run another independent? And of course, as you know, Indi decided that it would be ready with another independent should Parliament fall, or should Kathy decide, indeed, I won't be taking a third term. And I think there'll be others over the course of the weekend talking about the candidate selection process and how the community came together to meet with potential candidates and decide together whether they were willing to back one. This is a picture of me and Alana, and this is at the Voices for Indi Candidate Selection Forum in January 2019, when indeed, together with two other women, I stepped forward in the deliberative forum. And at the end of the day, and you can see we both look a bit hot. I think I look hot and bothered. Alana looks calm and cool as usual. But we've stepped outside of that forum, and I have been invited by the community to be the next independent candidate for Indi should Kathy retire. I was having, as most people do when they decide to take on the adventure, a few very serious second thoughts at that moment. And if you could read the text messages from my friends that afternoon, most of whom did not know I was making such a decision, I was getting a lot of "what the hell do you think you've done" messages. But that, of course, is a scary thought unless you have an entire community behind you. So here I am with the mentor. That was the Saturday in January, and the following Monday, Kathy announced to the media that she was indeed not running for the next election. And she stepped forward with me in front of a very large media throng in Indi in Wodonga. And we faced the media. Kathy was a very experienced media campaigner at that point, and you can maybe see the look on my face there, a bit of a bunny in the headlights. I indeed was not so experienced, but I had Kathy beside me, and look at the look on her face, smiling, happy, confident, a mentor. And there was the very first cartoon that appeared in the press the very next day. So I look like I've lost my false teeth, actually. So the humility comes very, very quickly. And so the story goes on. And then the press became involved. It became obvious that the people of Indi, the community, were going to get behind another independent. And look at the language in this Guardian article. Independence Day, the Orange Army and its battle for Indi. Can Cathy McGowan's anointed successor keep Indi independent, or will the coalition strike back? It is the classic tale, isn't it? But the thing that I think is fantastic about this is in those headlines, while there's a picture of me, it doesn't hold my name. It talks about the Orange Army. It talks about the community. And it talks about an anointed successor. And that is a key component of what the Community Independent is all about. They're backed by the community. And so the story goes, and as you heard, I'm a midwife and I understand attachment theory, and I know that the community was so attached to Kathy, and what Kathy and I and all of our community needed to do, or all our campaign team, was transfer the love, was move the attachment, was to grow the trust across the electorate that Kathy had been a fantastic member of Parliament and that we could do it again with another independent. And so our first brochure shows Kathy and I together, back to back, transferring that attachment. That was an important brochure. And here we have our incredible community campaigners. Just look at this. If you remember the story from the Hunger Games, they had a mascot. It was called the Mockingjay. Well, we have the orange cockatoo. And look at that. The orange cockatoo is flying everywhere. It's a key talisman of our movement. And so as we move through the mythology story, there were tests, there were allies, there were enemies. I had to cross into the innermost cave. And in the last week of the election process, the election campaign, I felt like I really did go into that innermost cave. And I've got to say that as a brand new, never before politician, as someone with a very ordinary journey, a person who'd never been a political staffer or hadn't been through that whole sausage factory of becoming a politician, to step into the cave like that on Q&A was quite a big moment for me. But for us as a campaign, we felt it was a turning point, as was the final week of the campaign, when we'd been bombarded across the electorate with letterbox drops and some pretty awful behaviour from the major parties. And indeed, coming right into election day, there was a big gathering in Wodonga, and Alana just mentioned she heard me on Statewide Drive, I think just now, and Statewide Drive was in Wodonga, and together with the other candidates, the National Party, the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, and the Greens, we spoke on radio. And it was at that moment that Nicole Shavastik actually asked me what I thought about the campaign letterbox drops into Indi. And I had the opportunity to go to exactly what community independents are built on, and that's values. And I was able to ask the Liberal Party candidate, how do your values align with what's going into the letterbox this week? And I think it was a pretty important moment for all of us. And so, of course, you know the story. We won the election. We made history that night. And there you can see the mentor and the next independent candidate, and you can see the thrill and the excitement and the joy and the energy of the community. There they are. It was an extraordinary moment, of course. And then comes the next part. It's returning the elixir, which is the next part of the hero's journey, the community journey. And there it is, the orange symbol and Parliament House. And there it is, gathering the sword as the next part of the hero's journey. That's on the very first day, and taking the oath in Parliament House. And here we are on that day, and behind every independent candidate, of course, is their team. And there's a blank section on this slide, and it's blank because what to do next? Now I'm in the Parliament. How will I be? How will I do? But what I knew was I had a set of values that I could subscribe to. I knew that I wasn't in government. I knew that I wasn't in the opposition. I knew that my job was to look at every piece of legislation on its benefits for the nation, for Indi, and good governance. And so I had to find my voice. And for me, that voice was to pick up, of course, on the work that Kathy had done, but my voice had to take on a new narrative, and the narrative found itself because straight away, once I became the independent member for Indi, fire, sports rorts, pandemic, and now, as Alana alluded to, the very dreadful issues that are facing the Parliament. So I needed to step into my power and find my voice and really speak to these issues. And there, of course, in just over a year ago, the bushfire that swept across Indi meant that I had to step into a space that I was not expecting. And what I didn't know then, when I was 100% occupied by the impact of bushfires on Indi, was that COVID was around the corner. And Andrew Wilkie in the Parliament said to me, Helen, what do you think about COVID? And I famously said, COVID, I'm not thinking about that. I'm only thinking about bushfires, and how quickly that changed. And so my job was to carry on the good work that Kathy had started, and integrity was key to Indi. It's what I said I would work on. And I needed to find a way to bring the community along with me on that journey. And so back in early 2019, I'm lost in time. Early 2020, I brought the community together around a set of key principles, the Beechworth principles, which would underpin my work on bringing a strong and robust integrity commission to Canberra. And here is a picture that again indicates that you never do anything alone. And there are the members of the crossbench stepping out with me to talk about integrity. And that picture of me with the box is a petition that came from our day at the Beechworth Courthouse when hundreds and hundreds of people got together after that and signed a petition calling on the government for an integrity commission. And here's my crossbench colleagues. There we are. We're not so cross. We're having a laugh. We haven't got Bob Catter there. Not sure where Bob was, but he is amongst us. And of course, now we have a new member of the crossbench as well. And I'm sure there's a few voices for Hughes people here who know about that. And there we are again, stepping out together, talking about integrity with the retired judges, with members of the Senate crossbench, with members of the Labor Party. And this is about using everyone you can to work with you, to use the parliamentary tools to bring forward a message from the people you represent into the House. Again, the media, they like to have a look at this, and we can see here that our Federal Integrity Commission is well and truly taken up by the media. And there I am again with a very big set of glasses and the fix-it lady with a toolbox. I quite like that one. Key to being a community independent is to show up. Show up right across your community. Parliament isn't the place where all the action is, the electorate is. Show up wherever people invite you to and listen to what they have to say. Keep your ears open to the issues that are around you and take those issues to Canberra. And always have with you your Mockingjay. And there you can see that little cockatoo badge sitting with me wherever I go. And don't ever let anyone say that as a community independent that you do not have a seat at the table, because by jolly you do, jolly heck you do. And I would say one of the most important things I've learned is to sit at that table and ask for what you want. And it's important to do what you said you do. And on my first speech day, I talked about climate change and the opportunity that it offers for regional Australia. And here you can see the local power plan, which is a policy document I brought to Canberra, a policy document that was co-designed by the people of Indi and regional Australians from right across the nation. And just last Monday, I had the great joy of introducing to Parliament a piece of private members' legislation, the Australian Local Power Agency, and standing behind me there are some members of the 15-member expert panel, some of them from Indi, some of them from across the nation, and right beside me there, my great friend and colleague, Sally Stegel, who was the seconder to that bill. And again, you can see a little cockatoo sitting on my shoulder. And finally, I would say a community independent never walks alone. That's the difference. There's times when it's frightening. There's times when you enter that big, deep, scary cave. But every time you do, look around and look who's around you. And that's what I see. And so, in conclusion, back to the Hunger Games. Attendance is mandatory. Victory is yours, but you need to show up. You need to get involved. Behold the journey of our girl on the fire through all of Panem. A community independent is someone who's backed by the full strength of those around them. So I think I will end there and take it now to some questions. Thanks, Alana.
Hello there, I'm unmuted now. Helen, thank you so much. I am now going to wear my orange cockatoo badge with a whole different view of it. It's like got the power of the Mockingjay. So those who've watched Hunger Games, I think you've reframed the wearing of the badge for us. So thank you. We've had lots and lots of questions flooding in, but I think one of the obvious starting points is to talk about values, because as you said, they underpinned why you decided to step forward and how you've conducted yourself as the member for Indi. So firstly, talk to us a little bit about when you enter Parliament, how you hang on to those values, because I think a lot of us have seen that when politicians finish in Parliament, they actually become sort of likeable, principled people again, even statespeople. But we actually don't see them operate like that when they're being politicians. It seems like the environment is almost forces you to compromise your values. How do you as an independent hold strong to those, knowing that that's what the community wants you to do?
I think you've just given the answer, actually, Alana. I know that's what the community want me to do. And I know that I haven't come to Parliament as a single issue parliamentarian. I know that I've come to Parliament because the community was sick and tired of a lack of values in the greater politics. So it's just front and centre to me. And that slide I showed with me with my team, beginning of our team behind me on that very first day and the blank slate, there was that feeling of, God, I'm really not sure what I've got to do now. I'm rather frightened. I don't know whether I've got the skills. In fact, I'm almost certain I haven't. The one thing that holds me strong is knowing the values that this position brings with it: integrity, respect, honesty, transparency, inclusion, impact. And I think, I guess my training as a researcher teaches me too that you can bring a whole lot of things to the table, but at the end of the day, if you can't translate them into the practice of what you're doing, and if you don't have any impact, then perhaps you're wasting your time. So for me, that always holds me strong. And there's many times when I'm out in the community and people ask me questions, or people perhaps have a view that's not one bit aligned with mine on an issue. I always hesitate before I speak to just ground myself back in those key values of respect, to make sure that I always open an answer with that. I guess when I'm in the House and there's rapid motions being put forward, and often the opposition, of course, will move a motion that condemns the government for something, and there may be 3/4 of that motion that I actually really agree with, but the last 2 or 3 dot points will say something so hostile and disrespectful that, and in the end, I would never vote for that. And the opposition know it too. They often come across to over to the crossbench and speak with me and Zali and Rebecca in particular and say, look, we know you guys probably won't go for this because the language is a bit spicy for you. And we go, yeah, that's right, it is. So yeah, it underpins everything I do.
Do you think as an independent, it is you're more able to hang on to your values and use them as the underpinning guide for all of your behaviour? Do you think that there's a difference between how you can operate as an independent and what the parties require of other politicians?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's a member of parliament who wouldn't say that they have a set of values by which they operate. Everyone says that, and I'm sure they do. It's just this extraordinary deadlock that MPs from the parties are in, that it's so incredibly unusual now in Australia for an MP to vote against anything that their party is putting forward. So, I imagine there's a lot of internal conversations, and most people tell me when I ask them, how could you vote for that? I know that you don't really think that. And they'll say, I'm working hard inside the tent to change things. But on the floor of the parliament, I've been known to say to a few of my government friends, I'll say, it's one thing being inside the tent, but the campfire's outside the tent. This is where you need to show your values. And I think what we recently saw, during the cashless debit card debate, we had a really brave member of parliament, a first term member of parliament, the member for Bass, who is a really good friend of mine. And she really bravely spoke out against her party's position on the cashless debit card. But by golly, she was in the freezer for doing so, and in the end, she did not vote on that bill in the House. She abstained. So it's pretty hard, but I know that values are there for everyone, but it's how you exercise them in a material way at the end of the day.
Yes. So just to follow on from that, we have a question from Jeremy, and he's interested in your experience of needing to work in a context where you hold strong to your values. How do you deal with people who you see are perhaps needing to move or unable to express the value position that you know they have? And how do you deal with them?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just start with the most recent. And some of you may have heard I made a speech in the House a couple of weeks ago in regard to misinformation and vaccination and our COVID pandemic. And I called on the Prime Minister to be true to his values and to take some stronger discipline with one of the members of his own party who was spreading misinformation in a really dangerous way. So in that occasion, I very publicly called on the values of the government around that. And I'm not known for being a firebrand kind of MP who would be calling out individuals, but I felt so strongly as someone with a public health background and as someone who, I made a commitment right at the beginning of the pandemic that I would support the government all the way on our pandemic response, and I would be a leader in my community that was to give very solid evidence-based information, try and reassure people, try to be a voice of reason and not be a critic of the government or in any way make people feel anxious, more anxious than they already were. But in that occasion, I felt it was really important to call out that member of parliament and the misinformation that was being spread.
Yep.
I guess on a one-to-one basis in dealing with people in the community, and I get, like any member of parliament, I get some pretty awful emails at times. Or some pretty terrible messages on social media. And well, again, it's just important not to dive into that same kind of quagmire of bitterness and bad behaviour, really.
Mm. So just stepping back to 2019, we have another question from Carolyn, and she's interested in the issue of deciding preferences and how much that actually puts people in a position of compromising their values. So would you like to explain how that whole preference decision-making happened in Indi?
Yeah, look, and this goes back to 2013 and this discussion about if you are an independent, do you preference someone else? And across our community movement, we've had many, many long discussions about this, and a decision was made that we would not preference, that an independent must not really, well, we decided, would not preference someone else because that would really show your cards, I suppose. And I held on to that as well. I strongly believe that. I won't. I didn't preference in 2019 and I won't next time either. However, other people decide to preference an independent, and we saw that on the how to vote cards from other parties. And in Indi, we saw Labor and the Greens preferencing the independent, and we saw the Liberal Party and National Party putting the independent at the bottom of the ticket. So again, it's about understanding who the competition is, I suppose. But preferences are super, super important, and a key message from Indi was to talk to the people particularly in the National Party in our case, rusted on National Party supporters, and say, look, you know, I understand you're not going to give Helen or Kathy your number one vote, but maybe you could think about giving a number two. So we used kind of that understanding of preferences in our conversations with our community, in our conversations at the polling booth. Really important to do that. You know, I need preferences to win. So really important to encourage people to think about their vote and preference according to their own intelligence and their own desire about the kind of representative they want.
Which actually was a really quite a unique ask of voters, wasn't it? To actually think about what preferences meant. It required some raising of political literacy for voters, and the campaign went about that in a very serious way, didn't it?
Yeah, it absolutely did, Alana. And I think this is a key part of participatory democracy. You can't assume that people know how the whole thing works. So a really important part for all of you who are wanting to really bring your community along is to run some tutorials about this and to do some coaching. And I think preferential voting is pretty confusing if you've never really thought about it. And one of the things that I learned was to do scrutineering. And once I volunteered for Kathy as a scrutineer, I truly learned how preferencing worked. And I really then understood the power of convincing people to give you their number two. So it's a funny message in a way, but we do it a lot in Indi when we're, you know, very cheerily meeting people at the polling booth, is saying to them, all right, so you're not going to give Helen number one. Okay, look, you're crazy not to, but if you're not going to, give her number two. It's a really important conversation to have.
Yeah, and a conversation that's actually ended up being quite good fun and engaging for people, really.
Yeah. It really is. And I think this is key to it too. And you know, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I was a very reluctant starter about getting involved in politics. I wasn't so sure about knocking on people's doors or handing out how to vote cards. I was kind of always found that a bit cringy, actually. But when you learn to have the conversations with plenty of your friends around you and like-minded people, and you know that you can have a conversation without getting angry and nasty, and when you know that you can give people a few choices, like if you can't give a number one, give a number two.
Great. There's been a few people who've asked questions about pre-selection, which is actually not a term we've used in Indi, but let's go with this because people aren't necessarily aware of how things worked here. Later this morning in the community session, we'll talk about this in more depth, but you might be able to explain to everybody who isn't going to be attending that session. So firstly, how did the pre-selection process work for you, in inverted commas, and is it just like a small political party, was one of the questions.
Yeah, look, it's a really great question. And there are people on this call, and I'm looking straight down the barrel of a couple of them sitting in front of me on the screen. This idea of how do we move from having an independent member of parliament to getting another one, and Kathy becoming the independent member for Indi was a different journey and a different story. So moving from me to Kathy meant that we felt that there needed to be some kind of process. We needed to think about how does the next person emerge? You know, do you just kind of self-nominate? Or it was a really difficult discussion to try and work that out. And it took many, many months of very considered deliberation from Voices for Indi, who are there, of course, to increase participatory democracy and very engaged in the processes of doing so. So Voices for Indi spent many months working this idea through, and finally came to a process that was to bring together the people who had supported the independent movement in Indi, to ask them a question. First up, do you want to do this again? Like, maybe people had had enough. Maybe they thought, okay, we've moved the dial, that's enough. So the first point was, do you want to do it again? The answer came back very, very resoundingly, yes, we do. Then was the how will we do it again? And it was determined that a deliberative forum approach was going to be, I think, the most I guess, values-based way of people participating in how they choose someone else. So indeed, a date was put in the calendar to come together in Burnella at the community centre there. It could fit around, I think, from memory, around 300 people. They sat around tables. Anyone who was interested in becoming the community independent had gone through a process of nominating and completing some key questions, like making sure you weren't already a member of a political party, making sure that you complied with Section 44, which was pretty relevant at the time, writing a small piece about your own values and your own story, and then coming to that forum and telling that story of why you were here and who you were. And then it was up to the people around the tables to start asking questions. And that's quite similar, I believe. I've never been to a pre-selection in a major party, but I believe that's rather similar. But none of these people were members of a party. There were no delegates per se. And we were in a process then where that whole 300 needed to come to 100% consensus on who was going to be the next candidate, and that was done through a series of electronic voting that was coming up on a big screen, and bit by bit the 300 came to a consensus view about getting behind, in this case, me, and that's how we did it. I don't know, is that a reasonable explanation?
Well done. It is quite complex, so there's a lot of information on the Voices for Indi website for people who want to understand that more. But another question just regarding this notion of prior to your selection, Meredith wanted to know, how did you go about building your profile? How did people know who you were? How did you really progress that trust shift from Kathy to you?
Yeah, Meredith, that's such an important question. And I think the historical narrative about independence in Australia is that you needed to be a celebrity, that you needed to be someone with a very big profile. And I think I'm case in point. I reckon I had almost no profile, actually. I mean, I had 30 years working in rural health, and I had a profile within my own professional discipline. And being a midwife was kind of useful. There's a whole lot of women in the community who I'd cared for during their pregnancy and birth, and to this day there's still loads of people who come up to me and say, Helen, you were at my birth, which is pretty cool. But really I didn't have a profile, so we had to try and develop that. And again, we didn't do it in any we did it in a way that, I mean, the community did it. People spread the word. So yes, we fundraised like crazy, and we did all the usual things, like we produced brochures, we did television ads, we did billboards, we did all of those things. But it was actually getting in front of people that built my profile. So, the Orange Army, it was sitting at around 600 to 700 during 2013 and 2016. By the end of 2019, we had 1,700 community members working towards getting me elected. That's 1,700 people out there having, if they just had 10 or 20 conversations each, they were telling the community who I was. The other thing was there are many community candidate forums across Indi. So actually getting in front of people and presenting yourself that way is I think, a very powerful way for people to see who you are and for your profile to grow. Seeing is believing, and Again, I would say don't be too concerned if in your community you don't have an ex-football star or some kind of celebrity candidate. I think the power is with the people. It always is. The people will convince other people.
Yeah, great. We don't have a lot of time left, but I think this is a really interesting question. So this will come from left field a little bit. So somebody's asked, should the long-term aim be for independents to take government in Australia?
Oh, that's a great question. Look, I am so convinced in the 21 months that I've been a Member of Parliament that the best way now for us to truly get great public policy is to grow the crossbench, is to make sure that we have really high quality candidates coming forward as independents and joining the crossbench. And, we've got precedent in other nations around the world, you know them, where cabinet is made up of people from multiple places, not just a major party. Now, that would be a massive radical shift in the Australian Parliament. But I tell you what, I'm up for it. I think it's a shift we can demand in a way. Why not change history, We never thought in Indi we'd be able to get an independent. We thought we might be able to follow an independent with another independent, but by golly, we knew we were up against it and we did it. Warringah, I'm sure Warringah never thought that they would move to an independent, but look, by golly, they did. So I think anything's possible. I think what we're experiencing right now in the Parliament and the last 2 weeks have been the most distressing 2 weeks that you can think of, really. I've barely got words for it. But if ever there was a time that we as a nation need to take a long, hard look at the values that are the bedrock of our parliamentary system, then it's now. If there's ever a time that we have to say who is sitting on the benches of power, it is now. If ever there was a time to say, let's get some other people into the Parliament and let's shake the tree and provide really good governance, then it's now. And I think it would be amazing to see independents be forming part of a cabinet. I think it'd be incredible.
Yes, and again, I reiterate, your voice for Indi has been well heard in Parliament in the last 2 weeks, and thank you. It takes me back to 2013 when many people in Indi, people of my generation, were concerned about the political engagement of young people, their children. They weren't even choosing to vote. It's been an ongoing issue for many years, the sort of disconnection between young people and parliamentary processes. And I think what's happening in Parliament at the moment disillusions young people even more. So talk to us about young people in your electorate and how you go about feeling that you are truly representing them.
Yeah, actually last night, Alana, I was down in Benalla. I was down there till about 10 p.m. actually with the Benalla Sustainability Forum, and it was a really great meeting. There was about 100 people in the Benalla Hall, and amongst those people there listening to 2 climate scientists from the CSIRO was a whole bunch of young people. And I was so delighted to meet them. And during, I gave a short presentation as the federal member talking about what I was doing with the community around action on climate. And a couple of those young people stood up and asked me some questions about how can they get involved, what more can they do? And it was so fantastic to be able to say to them, well, you know what, you can come and work with me if you like. I just hosted 2 young people in Parliament last week. One was a new graduate from the Australia Institute who worked with me in the office for 2 weeks and helped write the speech on the Australian Local Power Agency bill, who's worked with my team, my policy team, all over the last 2 weeks and has contributed an enormous amount. We had a volunteer in our office who was a young woman. I've had young people from Indi come to my office frequently, the school strikers for climate change. I think if ever there was an opportunity for young people to engage in politics, it is through the independent movement, because there's no party structure to have to navigate. You know, if you want to get involved, you just can. You can sign up to the values and then use your own methods, you know, garner your own troops, get out and campaign in a way that makes sense to you. You're not being directed. It's this notion of radical trust that we talk about in Indi. And I think that what the independence movement has given many young people that I meet is a refreshed hope. And going back to the Hunger Games, hope is stronger than fear. And right now there's a lot of young people with very profound fear. Climate change makes for fearful reading. The pandemic has isolated young people in ways that they've never experienced before. And we need to give them an opportunity for hope and an opportunity to step right into the power as well. And I think the independence movement gives them a real opportunity to be part of this.
Yeah. So that takes us right back to your starting point, Helen, and it's been wonderful to have this conversation with you and to hear your presentation and for you to really set the stage for this convention today. So going back to the Hunger Games and the hero's journey, I think, you say the community is the hero in this journey. You are also a hero, but I hear your call for everybody to be their own hero, to do what Kathy says, to be the change we want to see happen. And you and Kathy have done that, and many people around you are doing it. So thank you so much. And we look forward to you being there as the voice. You found your voice in Parliament. You are the voice for Indi. Thank you.
Thank you, Alana. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.